Hi, everybody. Welcome back. I'm here again with Master Astrologer Greg Bogart. In this session, we're going to take a look at a chart or a few charts that he's chosen. So, Greg, guide us through where you'd start and what you'd prioritize and how you might wish to articulate some of these placements in the natal chart.
Well, the first thing is this first chart is somebody whose chart I had done 26 years ago and hadn't talked to her in 26 years. And when I was doing her preparation, I noticed that I was only seeing a few major transits and not a lot going on in the progress chart. So I was actually apprehensive about a half hour into this session because I wasn't sure how much we had to talk about until I started going a little deeper with a few things. So this chart has the moon at the midheaven. She's a mom. She's totally into her nurturing role. She has a combination of planets in the second house, and she runs she's the business manager for a company that does something of a very material nature. It's a business involving material construction. And so she's a financial and business manager. And yet she has this combination of energy in Sagittarius, which longs for learning, longs for a life of an intellectual nature, life of study and interest in music and poetry and mythology and philosophy, so many interests. So one of the key insights that we came to was that those planets in the second house that include Jupiter in Sag, Venus, Neptune, Mercury in Sag, was that she is someone who holds both positions, both qualities, that she functions in managing finances and business transactions, these planets opposing Saturn in the eighth house. Eighth house is shared finances, marital finances, and business agreements. She manages the business that her husband is doing the work on, and she's managing the bookkeeping and the accounts. So there's this practical emphasis of her life. Her life structures involve constant involvement in these conversations and transactions about debts and credit, money owed, money received, receivables, payables. It's all Saturn and Gemini in the eighth house. That's her daily life. And yet she also reads extensively. So she fulfills that part of her life that is scholarly, that is a thinker, that is a poet, and comes to be reconciled with this polarity of life. In other words, sometimes she described feeling a struggle, like being so involved with money and finances. Is that holding me back from my true path? Well, the chart affirms, no, this is where you function. This is your occupation, but it does not in any way prevent her from being learned, from being a lifelong learner and a writer, writing poetry, Mercury, Neptune conjunction, and being very into music, not a musician herself, but an appreciator of music and culture, Venus, Jupiter conjunction in Sag. So this was part of the line of conversation, is to affirm the life that is already in place. This is a good life. I had taken note of the fact, if we look to the right here, in her progressed chart, I had taken note of the fact that the progressed sun at 3.5 Capricorn had recently squared her natal and progressed Pluto. Pluto had progressed forward about a degree. And so that had occurred almost 4 years earlier. Let's call it 3.5 years earlier. 20, I forget what it was, 2016, 2017. Oh no, 2018. So the progressed sun was squaring natal Pluto about 2 years earlier in 2018. I asked if there had been a crisis involving her husband's health. Why did I ask that? Well, we know that the sixth house is the house of our health, the sixth house from the ascendant. But using the old horary technique of derived house analysis, we count from the husband's seventh house, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 houses. So the 12th house is the sixth house from the spouse seventh house. It governs the husband's, or in this, the husband's workplace conditions, and health. So her husband had had a major health crisis at that time, but he'd also had a crisis with a worker because he's a contractor, so he employs subcontractors and workers. So there had been a dispute and a struggle around that employee. So that's a Plutonian crisis. And also the husband's daughter had a hospitalization, a psychiatric hospitalization. And the fifth house from the seventh is Leo on the cusp, ruled by the sun. So here we're talking the progressed sun squaring Pluto. In this case, it was spending a certain amount of time visiting the hospital to attend to the welfare of this stepdaughter and her crisis, her emergency situation. So I had kind of, when you see something like this in preparing a chart, you don't know exactly what the story is going to be. So a big part of the art of counseling is asking questions. You say, oh, that is interesting that was occurring 2.5 years ago or 1.5 years ago. And what can you tell me about what was going on? And then we point in the direction of the husband's health or the husband's workplace, because they're in the sixth house from the husband's seventh. And you might sometimes see a person going through a crisis about aloneness, solitude, isolation at such a time. The only thing she said is, my husband was at work all the time, so I've felt somewhat alone a lot of the time, but she got through that. So we see that a threshold had been crossed. These are the kind of aspects that I look at in preparing a chart, is what is the progressed sun doing? What planets is it aligned with? That's what I do in every chart reading. I follow the movement of the progressed sun and its aspects. But then, coming back to the transiting planets, I didn't, let's see if I could do the current transits. Well, the current transits have Saturn, Jupiter, and Pluto down here in Capricorn, right? The observer can picture Saturn, Pluto, and Jupiter down here in her fourth house. And our conversation got significantly deeper when I thought about that more. Now, as Saturn crossed into her fourth house, she bought a house with her husband. They had been renting for 10 years. So when Saturn crosses any angle, that's always an important threshold, but when it crosses the fourth house cusp and begins moving through the fourth house, there's an important phase of establishing a residence or improving it, or in some way defining or demarcating a workspace or home space. In this case, purchasing a house. Great. So a lot of involvement with renovation. You would expect that with Saturn and Pluto transiting the fourth house, tearing things apart, putting them back together, reconstruction. So all of that is going on. So we traverse that, but then I inquire a little deeper. I think, is there anything being uncovered about the family, the genealogy, something that you're learning about your ancestors, your history? She thought about it for a moment and she said, earlier this year, I took a DNA test and learned that my great-grandfather had abandoned his first family and children, disappeared, and remarried, and had a whole new group of children, gave them all the same names, had this second life. Nobody knew about the first family. This was buried as a family secret. And she said, I always thought there was this bizarre quiet, this hush over our family, and that there was this sense of shame about our ancestors. She called it ancestral shame. And she said, it brought to light a lot, a sense that there had been a lot of secrets in the family, and it unleashed a lot of emotion. And she discovered a whole new group of relatives, a whole clan of cousins, relatives from this prior family of her great-grandfather. Are you following this, Frank?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
So if we dwell with the symbols and just sit with it enough to think there's got to be more to this Saturn and Pluto in the fourth house. Yes, buying a house and reconstructing it, renovating it is huge. On an emotional level, there was this whole other layer about family that was unfolding right at that time, like this year, under the transit of Saturn and Pluto in her fourth house. So to me, that's very interesting. So one of the features that I try to bring to my work is to not try to be predictive, but to be evocative, to bring forth through dialogue and conversation life themes, existential themes, and discovery of meaning that is spontaneous. So the chart reading is process work. It's not a monologue where I'm droning on, telling them exactly the precise events that I think are going to happen. No, it's the evocation of meaning together in the moment. That was so meaningful for her. And so this is an example of a chart session where we didn't talk about a great many astrological transits and progressions. Another thing that I meant, but what we did was try to go deep with just a few things.
Yeah.
I did notice that Saturn in Capricorn, so Saturn is now at 25 Capricorn, 25 or 26 Capricorn. One thing that I do a lot that some astrologers do, others don't, is I look carefully at the 45-degree and 135-degree aspects. It's easy to see a square or an opposition or a conjunction. Everybody sees that, the trine and sextile. But Jupiter at 10 Sag is 45 degrees from 25 Capricorn. And Saturn is turning stationary direct in September at 25.5 of Capricorn. So we talked at length about Saturn transiting to Jupiter, that she was feeling a strong urge for education, to sign up for a class, to do something to advance her knowledge. And so those are transits that are important to look at, or the fact that Pluto, when Pluto was recently at 18 Capricorn, it was semi-square to Venus at 3 Sag, and that she had rediscovered a bunch of music that was meaningful to her and felt enlivened through music and culture.
So is the 45, does it have a particular meaning for you, the semi-square?
Well, listen, I'm not very precise in how I attribute meaning to specific aspects. The best book on this is Bill Turney, his book Aspect Analysis. What is his book called?
Dynamics?
Dynamics of Aspect Analysis. Fantastic. Clear delineation of how the opening square is different from the closing square, how the opening's sesquiquadrate has a different meaning than the waning sesquiquadrate. I am not that Virgo guy who can do that. To me, I look at energy interchanges between planets at any of their phases. I'm not saying they're all roughly equivalent, but I'm more concerned about the planetary pairs. I'm more concerned that it's a Saturn-Jupiter contact, a Venus-Pluto contact. That's what guides my interpretation more than the specific angle. Of course, I look at things like outer planet trines as having a particularly helpful, constructive tone. But I don't look at the hard aspects, the square, the semi-square, the opposition. I don't look at them as, quote, difficult. What you might have sometimes are difficult planetary pairs that are more volatile and less sedate in their interaction, regardless of the aspect.
Such as?
Well, Mars and Pluto. Mars and Pluto. I just did a chart. I'm wondering if this is one of the ones I selected. So that's an example, or Sun and Saturn.
So it's the dialogue. It's the dialogue between.
It's the planetary pairs that I think are the most significant to investigate. And so combination of stellar influences is the starting point for understanding planetary pairs, but it's not the final word of interpreting planetary pairs. We have to learn through years of tracking contacts so we can see a consistency of Jupiter-Saturn contacts, so that we, for example, see this upcoming conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn as one phase of a 20-year cycle. We're in the conclusion right now of our Jupiter-Saturn cycle, and then we'll have different phases of it coming over the next 20 years.
So in some way, looking at the transiting Saturn semi-square her natal Jupiter, it's because she's talking to you in 2020, and that's an aspect that's occurring right now. So it's pertinent rather than waiting for them to square or oppose in 5 to 10 years' time. So it's really about what you're facing right now and what she's needing.
Yes.
Okay. Great. Thank you. And what's interesting, if we come back to the Sun, progressed Sun square the natal Pluto and the progressed Pluto, you linked it very strongly to the husband's work. But can be a provocative question these days. Do you still link the Sun in women's charts sometimes to the husband's work? Does it seem to reflect that still?
No, I don't ever do that.
Okay.
Because to me, the Sun is identity. I don't know very many women who live their identity through their husband. Women have their own identity. And they may have a strong natural connection to the moon just through their biological attunement to the cycles of change on a monthly basis. But no, I don't ever use that interpretation.
That's interesting. Thank you. Yes. And in looking at her solitude, the 12th house being activated at that time, was there anything else that you willing to share that was very much about her own Sun-Pluto development rather than the career crisis of the husband? Was there anything else that you remember or are happy to share?
Maybe a little bit of discussion about contacting, sense of the other side, a sense of consciousness of relatives on the other side, and interest in maybe understanding death, just thinking about it, thinking about people who she's lost. So I think that's good for this chart.
Thank you.
I'd like to move to a different chart if that's okay.
Please.
Thank you. So this woman is a lawyer, and this year she's had the Saturn and Pluto and Jupiter transits over her midheaven. And so she's at the top of her career. She's worked very hard, and I'll talk about that, to get ahead. And this year, when Saturn reached the degree of natal Venus, she was made a partner in her big law firm, which was very significant. Saturn conjunct Venus in the 10th house, a great recognition from her legal group. But the path to that was very difficult. By the way, I've only met her once. I've met her husband many times. So this is just based on limited conversations with her directly. But she has had these Pluto and Saturn transits squaring her natal Mars, Saturn, and Pluto. You see that? So in her birth chart, Mars, Saturn, and Pluto are in the 6th house. Now, to me, they are also affecting the 7th house. To me, I don't read house angles, chart angles as the strict demarcation of a house. To me, Pluto and arguably Saturn are setting. They're really all setting and affect the descendant. So sometimes I have to fine tune an interpretation, but if I feel a planet may affect 2 houses, because she's an exceptional hard worker and she has been through this tremendous grind of being a junior associate in a law firm and having them work her to the bone, work her so hard with intense competition in the workplace, viciousness in the workplace, people being uncooperative and aggressive in the workplace, dealing with power dynamics in the workplace, made to feel like she's being put in her place in the workplace, all kinds of plutonic dynamics. And this, over the course of several years, yes, 6th house influence, issues in the low back pain, kidney pain, and other health issues due to stress and strain. You would expect this during hard aspects of Pluto and Saturn in Capricorn, squaring these natal planets. Now, her husband over here is a very laid-back guy and provides tremendous support for Paula. And he is someone who works in the creative arts, and he's a producer, so he helps other people unfold their creativity. And he's really good at that. And he's sort of the nurturing guy, the sun conjunct moon. But his outer planet transits in Capricorn, Saturn, Jupiter, and Pluto, are over here in the 12th house. His career is totally on hold. His career is at a standstill, a lull. There are no music performances for he and his musical artists to perform in. He is getting the rewards of past work, though, because previous works are selling and making royalties. So there's the sense of karmic reward. Getting what came from past effort is now coming effortlessly, even while he's sheltered at home, spending all his time being the house dad, babysitter, gardener, cook, dishwasher, and all around, house manager, being the supportive moon guy and husband and father. And that's his current life. So why am I bringing this story up? Because as a couple, they're in very different places. She's out there achieving incredible things and getting status, recognition, and a high salary. He's making modest returns on his creativity, but not super visible right now. It's more in the background, cloaked and invisible. Now, also, the 12th house, as I said with the previous example, represents the partner's work and workplace. So her health issues are reflected in Saturn and Pluto in his 12th house. Her workplace competition, the intense effort to prove herself over several years. He's experiencing that, and yes, she's gone at work all the time. He's alone with their toddler. And astrology brings acceptance of where I am. Instead of judging and saying I should be out there visible and doing what she's doing, no, he's meditating. He's enjoying peace and quiet and solitude when he can get time alone. And she is on the front lines being an empowered attorney. And Saturn in Capricorn right now is squaring her natal Pluto. And so she's formed alliances with influential people in her field. They're fighting big cases involving corporations and big powers, very Saturn, Pluto in nature. So Saturn and Pluto in her 10th house is making her a person who carries power and influence, who is in the battle with the Plutonian forces, in basically corporate litigation. So she's living her chart potentials beautifully. But what's also helpful is that these transits of Saturn and Pluto squaring her natal planets in Libra, for several years, this put tremendous strain on their marriage because of the planets in Libra, which is naturally a sign of cooperation and harmony and achieving partnership. But Mars and Pluto there in Libra and Saturn in Libra have made that challenging, has created a certain amount of marital friction at times. What was most helpful for Jeffrey was to understand her transits, to understand what is being activated in her that makes her sometimes impatient or wrathful. You see? So he can have peace of mind. He can let her have her feelings and express them without being threatened by it, without it causing them to say, oh, we got to get a divorce. No, it's a transit to live through, to exhaust, to express. So she is doing that, and he is being who he's supposed to be. He's being the moon guy. He's a sunny, friendly, warm man, and supportive of his child and his wife and his artists. So this is an example of how couples can gain self-understanding and mutual understanding so that you can coexist. You don't have to be the same. So many couples break up because somebody says, he or she isn't like me. He or she isn't moving through the world the way I like to. No, they don't. They're completely different. This is the beauty of couples, is you have two completely different world organizations trying to collaborate and form a synergy that's greater than their individual separateness. So they're a phenomenal couple. And so that's a little taste of how I approached those charts. I could probably say more. This chart has great emphasis in the 8th house. So he has a lot of accounts receivable and payable. He's got a lot. He's a business guy. It's a small business. It's not like a big money maker, but it's a business. And there's international accounts. Jupiter is involved. He works a lot with music technology, Uranus, Jupiter conjunction. And gets bands together with the 9th, Mars in the 11th house. He He gets orchestras together to make a large sound. Mars in the 11th house of groups. And then, yeah, there's a lot more to say, but
Yeah.
do you have any questions?
Well, I do. I think you've explained the couples thing really well. Do you ever see people together, or have you seen this couple, for instance, separately?
The only time I met Paula, it was separately. But when when conditions have been normal pre-pandemic, what I would do is have a couple come and do maybe an hour on each chart separately, so that each person can discuss what's going on for them in the presence of the other. So we can say, oh, these are the issues I'm having. This is what's coming up for me. This is what's difficult for me right now. This is what I want to do. These are my goals. This is how my chart is propelling my motion forward in time, so that you understand your partner very well. Only on that basis do I put the charts together and do synastry and talk about the interactive patterns. Now, in doing those individual chart assessments, we can look at seventh house dynamics. One person has Neptune in their seventh house, and they experience their partner as disappearing or in denial or totally slovenly and chaotic, and they get to talk about how that is for them to have that. Or they have Venus in the seventh house, and they just so appreciate their good fortune in having such a kind, such an easygoing, beautiful, harmonious person, such a loving partner to live with. Or Mars in the seventh house. You get to talk about how it is for me that sometimes my spouse is aggressive and fiery and assertive and, won't back down or something. So this is great material for couples conversation and counseling.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. That's great insight to consider. And I think your summary of what relationships are, rather than how life would be so boring. I think if we found somebody who was exactly like we are, there'd be nothing to learn, nothing to explore, I guess. Just be
it's the charged polarities that create consciousness, whether it's doing individual dream work or chart work where you're seeing different polarized facets of the self, or whether you're looking at a couple and their polarized energies. It's the poles that magnetize and create a charge.
Well, on that note, thank you so much, Greg. I really appreciate your time and your expertise, and thank you for supporting UNICEF as well. And yes, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Frank.